you've also written about the because this was such a gendered society, right? I think, is it right that women were kind of helping a lot in these trials, but not really getting on the papers and things?
Yeah, I mean, you're in neuroscience, I believe, right? So you've heard of, you know, these things still happen today. It's not something that has completely gone away.
That's
That, you
true,
know,
yeah.
now we suddenly have gender parity on all of our papers and all of our grants and things. So part of it, I think, is just a deeper institutional legacy of women in science or women in STEM, or women in academics more broadly, or positions of power. But with that caveat, I will acknowledge that this is not specific to psychedelics. But what I find fascinating about how this relates to psychedelics is that very early on, I think there was a recognition, even if it wasn't articulated in a coherent way, there was a recognition that preparing someone for these sessions took a kind of labor, a kind of work. Some of that work is maybe taken for granted, but it was recognized that you can't just, you know, it's not a good idea to just spike the punch at some party and expect someone to have a therapeutic breakthrough. You know, there's lots of stories to suggest that that was bad. But in the clinical setting, you know, people were prepared for these experiences. They were acknowledged as they went through the experiences, often with an empathetic observer, that is someone who had gone through, at least had taken the substance themselves, sometimes at the same time. And then a period of integration that sometimes required creating space for someone to sort of process those feelings and those experiences on their own, but in a place where they weren't left entirely alone, but also to have someone there to talk to. And along the way, there are all sorts of bits and details of how to organize those sessions and how to create that structure, that what we're finding is that women were absolutely integral to a lot of the kind of details that we maybe later take for granted. You know, who brought the rose into the room? Probably Al Hubbard. Many people say that Al Hubbard was the one who introduced the rose. Whether he did or not, his wife was by his side many times, and she was often the one taking notes. She even adjusted the musical selections in the room at times. And many people remember Al Hubbard, and of course he's been written about by several people. But Ruth Hubbard, now I'm getting Roses and Ruths mixed up. Ruth Hubbard was very integral to this. And what I started trying to follow was, where were some of the women in these experiments? Some of them were paid, some of them were nurses or social workers participating directly in a paid environment. But many, many times there were wives of investigators who, you know, it wasn't necessarily uncommon for wives to participate in their husbands' careers. And I come from a farming background. This is just completely normal. Of course, you know, of course my mother would make the meals and prepare all of these things. And without that, the crop could not be taken off the land. But, you know, at the end of the day, the paycheck comes to the farmer who takes the grain to market, if I use that example. And so there's a similar kind of philosophy in 1950s science, where the men are the main breadwinners, and they go off and do the things that create the paychecks, but women and their children, in fact, often support the activities. And in the world of psychedelics, it becomes even more intimate, as wives are often the first people to take these substances with their investigator husbands, and to work through and to give language to those experiences, to almost help their husbands feel confident talking about them, to make sense of them, to give meaning to them. And I think that piece is really, really critical as we think back through the history of psychedelics, but also the contemporary ways in which we try to make sense of psychedelics in today's world. You know, how we give meaning to them, or whose words we choose to use, or how we prioritize those feelings of spirituality or psychological feelings of trauma, or whatever it might be. And so I think there's a longer legacy here of the gendered factors, whether we take the sort of macho alcoholic, or the, you know, woman who is described often with a sort of strong emotional state, who's able to like help you make sense of your experience. So I don't know, that sort of stuff kind of fascinates me as we think about psychedelics, even beyond the more institutional setting of women in science.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also something that hasn't really occurred to me before, that with all of the kind of sensitive or like nurturing aspects of psychedelic therapy, it didn't really occur to me that it's unlikely that men conditioned to be men in the 1950s in American Britain would have single-handedly been able to access all that stuff without some outside assistance. It makes sense that that was there.